And finally, and this is the kicker,
All right, let's see it.
if the founding fathers were not Bible-believing church-saying Christians, why did they put Leviticus on the Liberty Bell? Leviticus 25:19, proclaim liberty throughout the land of which you are in.
So the founders didn't put anything on the Liberty Bell because the Liberty Bell already existed almost 20 years before the beginning of what we call the founding era, and the founders didn't talk about the Liberty Bell. It wasn't even referred to as the Liberty Bell at the time, but the Liberty Bell would not become an important symbol until around 1830 when it became a symbol of abolitionism.
Okay, so before we go any further, here's the question. Was America founded on Christian principles according to Charlie Kirk, or was it just the product of Enlightenment rationalism and like deistic philosophy, according to Dan McClellan here? See, what he does is he weighs in, calling Charlie Kirk completely wrong about the Christian roots of America's founding. And I think this is a very important conversation. And so I want us to dive in. Now, before we do, I want to say this. I do believe that Charlie oversimplifies a few claims in this presentation of his about the Liberty Bell, etc. But Dan's rebuttal, I think, goes too far. Not just correcting Charlie, but there are three key things that I want to touch on in this video. Number one, I do believe that Dan minimizes Scripture, meaning its influence and how it shaped the minds and actions and behavior based on personal interaction and belief systems, going to church, what they claim to believe in their faith. I'm not saying all founders were Christians, okay? But I do think he minimizes the influence of Scripture in the lives of our founders. Number two, I believe that he also overemphasizes deistic influence. And three, that he distorts the American experiment. So those are the three things that I want to touch on today. So let's further this discussion.
And the Liberty Bell was commissioned in 1751 by Isaac Norris, a Quaker who was asked to commission it to commemorate the 50th anniversary of William Penn's Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges, which was an Enlightenment document which asserted self-governance, religious tolerance, personal liberty. So if you actually look at Leviticus 25:10, not 25:19, but 25:10, you see it begins, and you shall hallow the 50th year. This is the Jubilee year. And you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. So this was about commemorating the establishment of liberty, religious freedom, self-governance in the colony of Pennsylvania. And Isaac Norris, just like William Penn, was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideals. And that brings up the question of liberty, because...
All right, let me just stop there, because one thing that I want to say is that Dan, not Charlie, is correct about the Liberty Bell. And this is the clip that he's taking to make his case. So obviously, not entirely taking Charlie out of context, but just that one claim that he was mentioning about Liberty Bell as a piece of evidence to prove that our founders were influenced by the Bible and also Christianity. Now, the founding fathers did not put the verse from Leviticus on the Liberty Bell, as Dan says, to prove that they were Bible-believing Christians. We have enough evidence to support that elsewhere, which I'll touch on. But as Dan was pointing out, that the Liberty Bell was commissioned in 1751, long before the founding era. And yes, it wasn't called the Liberty Bell until the 1830s, when abolitionists, as he said, adopted it. And why did they adopt it? Because they believed that it was a symbol of freedom for everyone. So when it was initially designed and presented, it had significance about liberty in general. So Dan's right that the bell was commissioned by Isaac Norris, who was a Quaker. It was then later commemorated to William Penn's 1701 Charter of Privileges. But this is the key. Who is William Penn, and what is the Charter of Privileges? Because this is what he leaves out. Penn was not an Enlightenment secularist. He was a devout Quaker, which is why Isaac Norris, also a Quaker. Now, I'm not saying all Quakers had a biblical worldview, but they definitely leaned into the belief of God and held scriptures to a high regard. But specifically, William Penn, who's a devout Quaker and Christian, his political outlook was deeply rooted in biblical anthropology and divine law. So when you look at Leviticus 25, verse 10, this is not just a random historical inscription. Yes, it's a verse about Jubilee, but it's also a message about freedom from bondage. And this is something Dan leaves out, justice that's grounded in God's command. So this is far more than just the average deist perspective. Now, furthermore, when you do look at Penn's belief system and what he taught and how he lived his life, he believed in Scripture. He believed that liberty was a gift from God, not from man. So it was not a man-made construct, and therefore government had the right to, overreach and control every aspect of the American people. In 1681, he actually wrote a letter to the Native Americans of the region, within that region, explaining the foundation of his approach to governance. And this is what he said, quote, "This great God has written his law in our hearts, by which we are taught and commanded to love and help and do good to one another, and not do harm and mischief one unto another." That is not a deistic being. This is theism. Penn's belief in God and moral theology didn't originate from the Enlightenment, but it came from a Christian worldview. And that Christian moral theology helped shape their understanding of the political system, of governance. Self-governance is something that Dan will later talk about. And I'm not going to really address that specifically, because that was not the basis of what Charlie was talking about exactly. Somewhat it was, but that's not our main topic here. But it also helped shape their diplomatic practices and the notions of what liberty is in the development of the colony of early America. And so Charlie's main point, I do think, remains. I think he did not only did he misquote the passage, it's Leviticus, right, verse 10, not verse 19. But I also think that, though, when you look at Leviticus 25:10, that the overarching thing here that we have to understand is that Scripture permeated the public imagination at the time. So when you're talking about liberty, when you're talking about justice, when you're talking about the covenant, when you're talking about providence, these weren't just philosophical ideas. These were biblical concepts. These were doctrines that they held from the pages of Scripture that deeply shaped early Americans' mindset and also the moral language that we see. In fact, if you look at a lot of the political writings from our founders, they were citing Scripture 34% of the time, far more than any other source. Keep that in mind. Now, I know Dan probably would not cite someone like Bill Federer, but he adds that civic leaders regularly incorporated biblical principles into charters, state constitutions, and public declarations, not out of cultural habit, but because they believed morality had a transcendent anchor, an ultimate standard, that there is a natural law and is given by God. So yes, the Liberty Bell does predate the founding, but the biblical soil, the discussion surrounding it today, gave rise to both the Bell and the Declaration, and this is very rich and is very much alive, and why we need to have this conversation continually, because there are revisionists who want to rewrite history. So, yes, Charlie misquoted the passage, and he also applied it to the founders when it came before that, and they didn't recognize it until later. But I wanted to respond to that particular thing. Now let's get into the meaning of liberty. This is very important.
Kirk probably would have identified liberty with non-interference, at least on the parts of institutions that he didn't like. But that's not what liberty meant in the founding era. And I think Jonathan Gienap's recent book, Against Constitutional Originalism, has a very good discussion on that.
Now, of course, Dan's going to agree with this book, because I've looked at this book extensively, haven't finished it completely, but I've read it enough where he is a revisionist. He is not originalist. So he definitely does not hold to a position that the founders would have.
In the red box. Founding era constitutionalists, however, thought about liberty in a radically different way. To them, liberty was not synonymous with non-interference. It was not a measurement of whether or how much one had been coerced. Indeed, one could be heavily coerced and free. or conversely, lightly coerced and unfree. What mattered, what distinguished those who were free from those who were not, was whether one was subject to an alien will or a will of one's own. Liberty, therefore, could be realized only under a truly representative government, a government that embodied one's consent, and thus could be said to be acting in accordance with one's will. This, as well, is an outcome of Enlightenment rationalism and principles of self-governance and of liberty. And if you would like more on this notion of liberty, here are a bunch of sources that you can check out. So,
all right, so let me just respond to this real quickly. Dan argues here that the founders embraced a purely rationalist representative of ideas of what liberty is about. But again, I respectfully say that Dan's case omits a bunch of facts that point to Christian influence and persuasion on our founders. Now, I haven't had the time to dive into every single book that he just cited there on liberty, but as I mentioned before, a lot of them take a revisionist perspective, not an originalist perspective, because he's holding to a rationalistic perspective. And so I would push back on that. Now, the other thing that I would point out, though, is because later in this video, he will mention a few other people who helped shape the founders. And I totally am with him on this. Founders like John Locke. But here's the thing about John Locke. He believed that natural rights come from God's creative act. I co-authored a book a few years ago called Stand Strong in America, and it's primarily all about what built this country, what made this country great. And we focus on a few things. And we mention quite a few times John Locke and understood, significantly what he meant by natural rights under the direction and structure of a divine being that does transcends us, but is immanently and creatively involved in the affairs of mankind, which are God-given rights. William Blackstone stated that no law is valid unless it aligns with the moral law of God, which is another thing that I address in my book, Stand Strong America, is if we know that human beings have natural rights as God-given, there's self-governance, this ability of knowing right from wrong, and that justice needs to be applied when something is done to that hinders or abuses these type of laws that man that puts in place, not because they determine them so, but merely discover them, that it's inherent and innate, and we have to, as moral beings, to advance civility and to advance justice, we have to uphold law. Not in an abusive fashion, but in a way to protect people for self-governance. If you even look at the empiricist skeptic himself, David Hume, his ideas about liberty and the proper balance of government helped shape James Madison, and Hamilton's views on constitutional structure and ideals when it comes to the government. So they filter through this biblical understanding of human sinfulness, which is why when you see our checks and balances in our government is because they believed in original sin. And to have checks and balances, as I was pointing out earlier about self-governance, you have to protect the liberties of human beings. The government doesn't give those human beings, in this case we're talking about as Americans, these human rights. No, what they give them is they give them oversight because they know that it's God-given. And they give oversight so they can advance morality. John Adams himself confessed the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles, catch this, of, there it is, Christianity. That is one of our founders, one of the pioneers next to George Washington and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. He said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence. Who was he mentioning? The founding fathers. He was one of them. He was one that helped George Washington even advanced his name to be elected in the Continental Congress, who became his vice president. I was going to say vice principal, but became the vice president and then the second president of the United States. He was one that helped shape and debate and argue with the Thomas Jeffersons of the world and James Madisons. This guy knows. And what did he say? What we were able to achieve, the independence of our country, and the general principles that you see that are drafted in our founding documents was wholly Christian. Paul D. Miller, another American historian, points out how Christianity and republicanism merged to create a political vision centered on, catch this, rights, duties, and virtue. And what he was doing in articulating this, he was pointing out this, that when you define liberty as freedom for the good rather than freedom from the restraint, that is significant. That is very important for us to understand the distinction, which is goes back to why we fled. You know, if you go back to the pioneers really of this nation of ours, what we call them the Puritans and the Pilgrims, that's what they wanted. And that's how they viewed liberty. And that was a freedom that they had for the good rather than freedom from restraint. Now, Galatians 5:13, notice it says, you were called to freedom, brothers, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Now, it's talking about sin, but this also is applicable to what John Adams was talking about, is where we have these general principles of Christianity, this understanding why we have checks and balances. And I would have to say to Dan that that's the heartbeat of American political theology. Let me just be clear. I do not believe in Christian nationalism. I do not believe that this nation was meant to be a Christian nation. I don't think that you should be politicizing a religion over people. This is where you do get into the form of separation of church and state. It has more to do with the government not overreaching and infringing upon people's God-given rights to worship him. But the government is there to prevent people from using that sort of abuse so that people can freely worship how they deem, personally enriching. Okay. So that's what I would say in response to liberty. Let's look at his last and final thing.
The Liberty Bell is not really about the founding. It predates the founding, and it is more deeply embedded in Enlightenment rationalism.
It is one of the most sinister, most unsubstantiated lies that does not come up against any sort of academic scrutiny. This idea that the founding fathers were a bunch of Enlightenment common law deists.
So this is wildly uninformed and misguided, and it's asserting a false dichotomy. But to begin, the overwhelming majority of scholars agree that the founding period was influenced by and was characterized overwhelmingly by Enlightenment rationalism and deist thought. But it wasn't a binary, and that's where Kirk misrepresents things. And Kirk was not a scholar and could not and did not engage competently with scholarship. But when you look at the scholarship, what you see is the recognition of more of a spectrum, where you had Enlightenment rationalism and Christianity mixing together. And when you looked at the founders, they were going to fall somewhere along the spectrum from more Enlightenment rationalism deist and less Christian to more Christian and less Enlightenment rationalist deist. And the most influential founders were on the more Enlightenment rationalist and deist side of the spectrum. But again, it was not a binary. You had the influence of the two. And this is why, when we look at the literature that is cited by the founders, the four most popular thinkers of the time were Montesquieu, Blackstone, Locke, and Hume. Those are all Enlightenment thinkers. And as we already saw, the person who commissioned the Liberty Bell to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Penn's Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges. These two men were both heavily influenced by Enlightenment rationalism as well. In fact, there's a case to be made that the founding is actually a reaction against, or at least the pendulum swinging the other way, against the First Great Awakening, which was characterized by a lot of emotionalism, irrationalism, sectarianism, and anti-intellectualism. And that's precisely what the founders were pushing back against. And guess what Kirk advocated for? Sectarianism, anti-intellectualism, emotionalism. Now, he wants to pretend that it's not emotionalism, but he's appealing in his rhetoric, which is profoundly anti-intellectual, to the emotions of his audience. That's what made his message resonate with so many people, their feelings. The founders were pushing back precisely against that. That's why if you have a good understanding of religion in the American founding, you can see right through Kirk's lies, because the founding period was the period of least religiosity in the entire history of the colonies and the United States, coming as it did between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, when religious activity dipped and Enlightenment rationalism peaked. So Kirk's notion that it is some kind of sinister lie that the founders were Enlightenment common law rationalists is profoundly misguided. But, as I have discussed in previous videos, Kirk also appealed to the falsehood that the founders were influenced by the Bible more than any other document, which, as I have shown, is just a misunderstanding of research that was published in the 80s by Donald Lutz. And you can check out this video for more information on that.
All right, let's do this last clip that he's going to respond to with Charlie, and then I'll give my response.
Reason they hate it is because the reason they must say this is that if we actually go back to our Christian roots and we go back to where we once were, it's America's best hope for revival and for a great future.
Well, if we went back to our actual roots, which were not Christian roots so much as they were Enlightenment rationalist roots, that would be a good chance for revival, because it would be a return to personal liberty and self-governance and representative government and civic virtue. And one of the things I think is interesting to study about the founding period is the founders who advocated for civic virtue and then went and fought in the war and came out the other side and said, there is not enough civic virtue among the population of the colonies. We need something that's going to keep people in check, because they don't have the discipline. They don't have the civic virtue to properly exercise all this liberty. What Kirk is doing is not engaging, much less representing, actual data or scholarly thought. Kirk is coming up with ways to make people feel good about their identity markers, and with ways to make people feel angry at those who disagree. The Christian roots that Kirk is talking about are not the roots of the founding. The roots of the founding are much different. They're certainly influenced by Christianity, but what he's talking about is actually precisely the kind of thing a lot of the founders were pushing back against. And
well, that's some heavy claims that, Dan, you are making. Now, I want to say something to you, Dan, and I don't think you're aware of this, and I know you're a Mormon, but you definitely come in this response with a secular academic lens. And from this perspective, obviously, Scripture becomes an historical, cultural thing, while religion becomes a study of society and belief systems, but the two shall never meet. Now, Dan accuses Charlie, if you notice earlier, of a false dichotomy. And anytime people say that, you want to pay close attention, because when he says that Charlie commits a false dichotomy, he's accusing him of doing that. Yet, get this, as you watch that, if you noticed, Dan establishes his own between Christianity and Enlightenment, suggesting their mutual exclusivity. How ironic. You just committed a false dichotomy, Dan. Now, you also commit an appeal to authority. Several times in this video, scholars agree. Charlie doesn't come at a scholar level. Never said he did when he was alive. You also had a few ad hominems in attacking by questioning Charlie's motivations, calling his arguments emotional and identity-based. Now, that's a genetic fallacy, and I'm not here to start throwing out philosophy and logic, but this is why we need to have these open discussions, because I'm having a hard time trying to understand where Dan, in fact, is coming from, other than just his secular rationale, with this Enlightenment rationalism influence that he's trying to revise in the roots of what made this nation so great. So when you go back to this genetic fallacy, the argument being dismissed based on where it's come from rather than what it is saying. And I know I sound like a broken record on this topic sometimes, but here's the thing, what's important, and this is why I want to give a response to Dan's, weighing in to Charlie completely getting things mixed up and using emotionalism to heighten this awareness of basically what he's trying to apply is some form of Christian nationalism that Charlie's trying to advance. But as a Christian apologist, I have to say, worldview matters. God is not an absentee landlord of history. Our founders, in the entirety of their debate and way of living, was not through a deistic lens. They believe that God was actively involved in it. I just gave some quotes earlier, particularly from John Adams himself, from William Penn. And freedom is not a human invention. You don't see that in the writings of our founders. They believed it was grounded in not just God, but his very character. Now, here's the other thing. And I would love to have just a civil discussion with people like Dan, because his claim that the overwhelming majority of scholars see the founders as secular deists and reacting against the first Great Awakening's emotionalism is a classic appeal to the authority fallacy. When you do this type of thing, the majority of scholars, the sad reality, and I oftentimes can do this as well, I will admit, you bring in the sources that agree with you or that have shaped your worldview, so you're heavily influenced by them. But we want to be objective. When you start saying, though, the majority of scholars, that's just not the case. But you didn't cite any. I know you referred to some books about liberty earlier, but so I push that aside for now because, without identifying them, can't really acknowledge it directly. And no, also I would say it's not historically accurate either to say that the Great Awakening was all about strong emotion and was a total disregard of intellectualism to basically say that the first Great Awakening was anti-intellectualism. This was a revival of spiritual earnestness, of moral clarity, of biblical understanding that helped shape the identity of the colonists and would lead to ideas about the dignity of the individual, the role of conscience and freedom. So to have a total disregard of what, in fact, the Great Awakening brought this world and also, I should say, America and the rest of the world, I think, Dan, that was really, sadly, one of the poorest comments, if you will, in your rebuttal that you made. The Awakening was not irrational because it contained a substantial theological insight and public impact through influential preachers. Catch this, George Whitefield, whose sermons merged fiery passion. So if you want to call that emotionalism, okay. So was Martin Luther King Jr. just an emotionless anti-intellectual? Of course not. Did he give, fiery, magnificent, passionate sermons? Of course he did. But did he also have substantial ideas to go with them? Absolutely. And so did George Whitefield. So Dan's claim that the founders were disconnected from the Awakening does not hold. Why? Because, let me give one example. John Witherspoon was actively involved and became a key figure who served, yes, as a Presbyterian minister, but guess what? He was also the president of Princeton. He also was a mentor to James Madison. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So the Awakening didn't oppose the founding or the Enlightenment. It helped form both. So I would say to Dan that the founders weren't Enlightenment rationalist purists. They were synthesizers of Christianity and, yes, of the Enlightenment, of rationalism. But they understood as they read the John Locke's, the William Blackstones, the Derridas, the Rene Descartes, the David Humes, all of them, heavily shaped by Greek philosophers as well, and plays, but we won't get into that. So Dan calls for a return to Enlightenment rationalism as the true roots of America, but the founders weren't Enlightenment purists, as I said, they were synthesizers. And this could be seen in numerous published debates, articles, and letters of our founders who firmly argued from these three core beliefs. You will see this, especially when you see the writings between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. You see many of the writings that Alexander Hamilton himself wrote while he was by George Washington's side during the American Revolution. And on we go. But you will see repeatedly in the founders' documentations freedom that was grounded in moral truth. 2, that reason was governed by revelation that comes from God. And 3, as I said earlier, when it comes to self-governance, it's a government that is limited by the Creator's sovereignty. So the government doesn't force people to worship this God, but they recognize that he exists and they're held accountable to him. So the American founders didn't invent freedom. They recognized it as a gift that God gave them. That's why they said our rights are endowed by our Creator. So Dan, in all due respect, when you're describing the founding as just a product of secular rationalism, I don't know what founders you're actually reading. You're missing the core of the American experiment: faith, reason, and virtue that work together. Proverbs 14:34 declares righteousness exalts a nation. That's what built America early on. And it actually still remains the only foundation in which this nation can not only be preserved, but to continue to advance the good. So I appreciate you guys watching. My friends, thank you for watching this video. I hope this helps you guys so you can continue to defend what is really true about the roots of America. Make sure that you guys like this video, subscribe to this channel. That helps us continue to equip Christians just like you to stand strong in their faith with wise thinking and bold living. Until next time, keep standing strong in your faith.